I traced the rim of my wedding ring with my finger, the gold band worn thin after 50 years. The celebration had been grand, our golden anniversary, with children, grandchildren, friends, and colleagues from Richard's firm all raising glasses to our enduring love. If only they knew what I'd discovered the very next morning. The house was quiet now, Richard having left for his weekly golf game with the boys from the firm. Strange how regular that Sunday appointment had become over the decades, rain or shine. How trusting I'd been. How perfectly, stupidly blind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat at my antique writing desk in the sunroom, overlooking my carefully tended English garden, the roses just beginning their summer display. Spread before me was the evidence I'd gathered over the past 6 months. Bank statements, property, deeds, birth certificates, and photographs. So many photographs. 50 years, I whispered to the empty room, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Half a century of lies. It had begun with a simple phone call, a wrong number that wasn't wrong at all. The day after our lavish anniversary celebration, while Richard was in the shower, his private cell phone had rung. Not his business line, that I knew about. The other one. The one I'd discovered tucked inside the lining of his golf bag 3 months earlier, while searching for a misplaced jewelry box key. I'd answered it, curious about the caller who'd dial so early on a Sunday. "Richard, darling," a woman's voice had purred. "We missed you at Eliza's recital yesterday. The children were asking for their grandfather. I told them you'd make it up next weekend." I'd said nothing. My breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. "Richard? Are you there? It's Catherine." I'd hung up, my hands trembling, and replaced the phone exactly where I'd found it. Then I'd walked calmly to our bedroom, chosen a suitable outfit for brunch with our daughter Rebecca, and proceeded to act as if my entire world hadn't just cracked beneath my feet. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of meticulous investigation, of hiring private detectives, of learning how to track digital footprints, of discovering financial trails spanning decades. I, Eleanor Harrington, retired literature professor, grandmother of 5, volunteer at the public library, had become a spy in my own marriage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The maple grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11, breaking my reverie. Richard wouldn't return until late afternoon. The Sunday golf game was followed by drinks at the club, then dinner with colleagues. Now I knew better. Now I knew everything. Catherine Williams. His other wife, not legally, of course, but in every practical sense. 3 children with her, James, Eliza, and Thomas. 6 grandchildren. A 5-bedroom house in Portsmouth, just 90 minutes from our Georgetown home. 28 years of parallel life, hidden behind business trips, weekend conferences, and those sacred Sunday golf games. Nearly 3 decades of perfect deception, funded by money that should have been part of our retirement, our estate, our children's inheritance. Money that had instead built a second family's future while maintaining our comfortable but increasingly conservative lifestyle. Richard always knew how to stretch a dollar. Our friends would joke at dinner parties, praising his financial acumen. If they only knew how far he'd really stretched it. I opened the leather portfolio containing the dossier compiled by Marquez Investigations. Photographs of Richard at Thomas's college graduation. Richard walking Catherine down the beach, his arm around her waist. Richard bouncing a toddler on his knee, a grandchild I'd never meet. 30 pages of documented betrayal, each image a dagger. The irony wasn't lost on me. For our anniversary, Richard had given me a diamond bracelet, pretending to be shocked when I'd marveled at its extravagance. "Only the best for you, Ellie," he'd said, kissing my cheek as our guests applauded. "You deserve the world." Meanwhile, his other family lived in a house with an indoor pool and a view of the Atlantic. The inheritance from my parents, the money, that was supposed to be our cushion in old age. The money Richard had insisted on investing for us had been systematically siphoned to accounts I couldn't access. Until now. I'd been carefully brought up not to be vulgar about money. My mother had instilled in me the belief that a lady never discussed finances. She simply trusted her husband to handle such matters. Mother would be horrified by what I'd done over the past 3 months, but Mother had never discovered that her husband of 50 years had been living a double life. The elegant fountain pen felt heavy in my hand as I signed the final document authorizing the transfer. Evelyn Chen, my financial advisor and the only person who knew what I was doing, had arranged everything with impressive efficiency. "It's all legal, Mrs. Harrington," she'd assured me during our last meeting. "The accounts are in your name. You're simply relocating your assets." "To the Cayman Islands," I'd clarified, still somewhat stunned by my own boldness. Evelyn's smile had been small, but fierce. "To an account only you can access. I've ensured the transfer will be untraceable. Once completed." I hadn't asked how she'd managed that. Sometimes, ignorance truly was bliss. My phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. "Transfer complete. All assets secured. Call if you need anything." I set down the pen and closed the portfolio. Beyond the window, a hummingbird hovered at the feeder, wings beating so rapidly they appeared motionless. I felt a strange kinship with the tiny creature, seemingly fragile but capable of incredible feats of endurance and adaptation. Richard's secret family had been sustained by my family's money for 28 years. His careful system of shell companies and diverted investments had funded private schools, summer homes, luxury cars, and trust funds for children and grandchildren I'd never met. Nearly 30 years of calculated betrayal from the man who'd stood beside me at our anniversary party, toasting to honest love and enduring partnership without a flicker of shame. The transfer was complete. Every account, every investment, every property deed, liquidated and transferred to my new accounts, leaving only the Georgetown house and a modest monthly income for Richard. Not enough to maintain both households, certainly. Just enough so he couldn't claim complete abandonment. I'd learned from the best, after all. The doorbell rang, startling me. I wasn't expecting visitors, and Richard had his keys. Carefully, I gathered the documents and locked them in the hidden compartment of my desk, another recent addition to my life of newfound secrecy. Through the peephole, I saw Rebecca standing. On the porch, her smile bright and unsuspecting. My daughter, who adored her father with unquestioning devotion, who had no idea she had half-siblings living less than 2 hours away. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. The hardest part wasn't taking the money. The hardest part would be deciding what to tell our children, Richard's legitimate children, about the man they thought they knew. I opened the door, fixing a pleasant expression on my face. "Rebecca, darling, what a lovely surprise." "Hi, Mom." She kissed my cheek and breezed past me into the foyer, the scent of her perfume, Chanel, always Chanel, lingering in her wake. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Is Dad here?" I tried calling, but his phone's off. "Golf day," I replied, the familiar explanation rolling off my tongue with practiced ease. "Of course, those sacred Sundays." She laughed, heading toward the kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of someone returning to their childhood home. "I brought pastries from that French place you love." I followed her, watching as she moved around the kitchen, retrieving plates from the cabinet where they'd always been, filling the kettle for tea. My beautiful, accomplished daughter, who had inherited her father's confidence and my love of literature, who had no idea that her entire life was built on carefully constructed lies. "Mom, are you okay? You look a little pale." I forced a smile. "Just tired, dear. The anniversary party took a lot out of me." Rebecca nodded sympathetically. "It was quite an event. Dad really went all out this time." Yes, he had. The lavish celebration at the Willard Hotel had certainly been impressive. and funded entirely by my recently inherited shares of my brother's pharmaceutical company, though Richard had happily accepted the compliments for his generosity. "Half. A century deserves a proper celebration," I said, keeping my voice light as I reached for the tea canister. "Tell me about your week. How are the children?" As Rebecca launched into stories about my grandchildren's latest achievements, I smiled and nodded in all the right places while my mind calculated the timing of what would come next. Richard would return from his golf game around 5. By then, his banking apps would show the devastating truth. By dinner time, his carefully balanced house of cards would begin to collapse. "Mom, are you sure you're all right? You seem distracted." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I'm fine, darling. Just thinking about how quickly time passes. It seems like yesterday you were the one with the dance recital and soccer games." Rebecca smiled. "Speaking of which, Emma has a piano recital next Saturday. She'd love for you and Dad to come." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. I didn't mention Richard's attendance. By next Saturday, everything would be different. As we chatted over tea and pastries, I felt a strange calm settling over me. The decision had been made, the money was moved, the next chapter was about to begin. After Rebecca left, promising to call later in the week, I returned to the sunroom. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the garden, and I knew I had about 2 hours before Richard returned. I opened my laptop and logged into my email, finding the message from my attorney confirming our appointment for tomorrow morning. The divorce papers were already drafted, waiting only for my final approval before being filed. Richard wouldn't see that coming, not after the perfect anniversary celebration, not after 50 years of what he believed was successful deception. My phone buzzed again with another text from Evelyn. "Second phase complete. Properties secured." That meant the beach house in Maine, the one Richard had insisted we put only in his name for tax purposes, was now legally mine again, along with the mountain cabin in Vermont. I'd always loved those retreats more than he had. Now I understood why. They had merely been investments to him, assets to balance against his other life's expenses. The grandfather clock chimed 3. Time was moving forward, carrying me toward the confrontation I'd been preparing for during these past 6 months. I'd considered many scenarios, dramatic confrontations filled with righteous anger, cold dismissals where I simply handed him signed papers, even quietly disappearing without explanation, letting him discover the financial devastation on his own while trying to explain my absence to both families. In the end, I'd chosen calculated honesty. I would tell him exactly what I knew, what I'd done and what would happen next. No histrionics, no begging for explanations. Just the quiet declaration of a woman who had finally seen the truth and refused to look away. I went upstairs to our bedroom, the room we'd shared for decades while he divided his heart elsewhere, and began packing a small suitcase. Nothing dramatic, just enough for a few days at the Four Seasons downtown, where I'd booked the presidential suite using one of my new credit cards. A small indulgence before the storm. As I folded silk blouses and placed them carefully in the luggage, I caught sight of my reflection in the full-length mirror. At 72, I was still striking. Silver hair cut in a stylish bob, posture straight from years of my mother's rigorous training, skin-lined but well-maintained. People often commented that Richard and I made a handsome couple, especially for our age. I wondered if Catherine had gray hair too, or if she colored it. I wondered if Richard compared us, if he had favorite features from each of his lives. I wondered if he truly loved either of us, or if we were both just convenient arrangements in his compartmentalized existence. The sound of a car in the driveway pulled me from these thoughts. I checked my watch, barely 4 o'clock. Richard was early. Moving to the window, I watched as he emerged from his Mercedes, golf clubs nowhere in sight. His face was ashen, his movements jerky and panicked as he slammed the car door and rushed toward the house. So he knew. The financial alerts must have reached him sooner than I'd anticipated. I closed the suitcase and set it by the bedroom door, then made my way downstairs, each step measured and calm. By the time Richard burst through the front door, I was waiting. In the living room, seated in my favorite armchair, hands folded in my lap like the proper lady my mother had raised me to be. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice a hoarse whisper as he stared at me with wild eyes. "Eleanor, what have you done?" In 50 years of marriage, I had never seen him lose his careful composure. Richard Harrington, respected attorney, civic leader, family man, always in control, always measured, always lying. "I've relocated our assets," I said simply, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You've—" He stopped, running a trembling hand through his silver hair. "The accounts are empty. Everything's gone." "Not gone," I corrected. "Simply moved to more secure locations. Locations only I can access." His face contorted with an emotion I couldn't quite name, rage certainly, but also something else. Fear. Richard was afraid, and the realization sent a strange thrill through me. "Why would you—" He stopped again, his lawyer's mind clearly working through possibilities. "Is this some kind of joke? Some kind of anniversary surprise?" I almost laughed at the desperation in his voice, the childlike hope that this was all a misunderstanding that could be explained away. "Catherine called," I said quietly. 2 words. Just 2 words, and half a century of deception crumbled between us. Richard's legs seemed to give out. He sank onto the sofa across from me, his face draining of what little color remained. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. "Does it matter?" I countered. "Would it hurt less if I'd discovered your secret family? Last week instead of 6 months ago? Would it somehow diminish your betrayal if I'd only known about Catherine and your children for a day instead of half a year?" "They're not—" He stopped himself, apparently reconsidering whatever defense he'd been about to attempt. "I can explain." Now I did laugh, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Can you? Can you explain 28 years of living a double life? Can you explain the 3 children you've raised while married to me? Can you explain the money, my family's money, that you've diverted to support them?" He flinched at each question, his usual confident posture collapsing inward until he seemed physically smaller than the man who'd left for golf this morning. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said finally, falling back on the oldest excuse in the world. "And yet you made it happen, day after day, year after year, for nearly 3 decades. I kept my voice steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my tears or rage. 28 years of conscious choices, Richard. Nearly 10,000 days of deliberate deception. "I thought I was doing what was best for everyone," he tried again, his hands spreading in a pleading gesture I'd never seen him use before. "I didn't want to hurt you or the children. I tried to take care of both. Both families. With my money," I reminded him. "With the inheritance that should have gone to our children, your legitimate children." He winced at the word, legitimate, his eyes darting to the door as if calculating an escape route. "The money is just money, Eleanor. We can work this out." "The money was never just money, Richard. It was security. It was our children's future. It was the reward for my family's hard work. And you stole it to build another life that you preferred." "To the one with me, that's not—" "Save it," I interrupted, rising from my chair. "I have no interest in your explanations or excuses. They're 50 years too late." From my pocket, I withdrew a business card and placed it on the coffee table between us. "My attorney will be contacting you tomorrow. I suggest you find representation. Quickly." Richard stared at the card as if it might burst into flames. "You're divorcing me? After 50 years? Eleanor, be reasonable. Think about the scandal, the family." "Which family, Richard?" I asked softly. The one in Georgetown or the one in Portsmouth? Which family's reputation are you concerned about damaging? He had no answer for that. I walked to the foyer and retrieved my suitcase, which I'd left by the staircase earlier. Richard followed, his movements frantic now. Where are you going? You can't just leave. We need to talk about this. I'll be at the Four Seasons for a few days, I informed him, pulling on a light jacket. I've left you access to one account with enough for basic expenses. The house remains in both our names for now, though that will change once the divorce proceedings begin. Divorce proceedings, he repeated numbly. Eleanor, please. 50 years. 50 years of lies, I finished for him. Goodbye, Richard. As I opened the front door, he made one final desperate attempt. What about the children? What will you tell them? I paused, my hand on the doorknob. I haven't decided yet. Perhaps you should consider what you'll tell yours, all of yours, when your carefully constructed world falls apart. With that, I walked out the door toward the waiting Uber I'd scheduled hours earlier, leaving Richard standing in the doorway of our home, his face a mask of shock and dawning realization. As the car pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see that I hadn't already memorized during 50 years of marriage. Instead, I looked forward, toward the unfamiliar future I'd created with a few signatures and the courage I'd discovered within myself. The hardest part was yet to come. The conversations with my children, the legal battles, the inevitable public exposure of our family's private shame. But for now, for this moment between the life I'd thought I had and the one I was choosing for myself, I felt something I hadn't expected. Freedom. The sun was setting as we drove toward the city, casting long shadows across the familiar streets of Georgetown. Tomorrow would bring complications and consequences. Tonight, I would sleep peacefully for the first time in 6 months, secure in the knowledge that I had finally taken control of my own story. And I had 50 million reasons to never look back. The presidential suite at the Four Seasons felt both too large and too confining as I stared out at the Washington skyline. Night had fallen, transforming the city into a glittering landscape that seemed to mirror the chaos of my thoughts. My phone had been buzzing incessantly for the past 2 hours. Richard, of course, his desperation growing with each ignored call. I silenced the device and set it on the nightstand. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough with its demands and explanations. Tonight belonged to me alone. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my contemplation. Room service with the dinner I'd ordered but had no appetite for. I tipped the young man generously, perhaps too generously, judging by his startled thanks, and wheeled the covered tray to the dining area. The salmon remained untouched as I instead poured a glass of the Chateau Margaux I'd ordered, Richard's favorite wine, ironically. I'd never particularly enjoyed it, but tonight it tasted like victory. My personal phone, the new one Evelyn had helped me secure, with a number known only to her and my attorney, chimed softly with a message. Initial legal paperwork filed. Judge Henderson assigned to case. Good news. Judge Henderson. I allowed myself a small smile. Mary Ann Henderson had been 2 years behind me at Radcliffe. We'd reconnected at an alumni event 5 years ago, maintaining a casual friendship since. Richard had always dismissed her as that feminist judge, unaware that his dismissal of strong women would one day become his undoing. Another chime. Meeting confirmed for 9 a.m. Car will collect you at 8:30. I sent a brief acknowledgement, then turned off this phone as well. The silence felt sacred. The suite's bathroom was extravagant. Italian marble, gold fixtures, a soaking tub that could easily accommodate 2 people. I ran the water as hot as I could stand, adding the lavender bath salts provided by the hotel. As I sank into the steaming water, I tried to remember the last time I'd indulged in such a simple pleasure without worrying about Richard's schedule or expectations. Too long. Far too long. My wedding ring caught the light as I lifted my hand from the water. 50 years on my finger, a perfect circle meant to symbolize unending commitment. Now it felt like a shackle, the last visible evidence of a contract that had been broken decades ago without my knowledge. With deliberate slowness, I twisted it off my finger. The pale indentation beneath would take time to fade, a ghost of what had once been there. I placed the ring on the marble countertop, where it sat like an accusation. My skin had pruned and the water cooled by the time I emerged from the tub. Wrapped in the hotel's plush robe, I padded across the suite to where my suitcase lay open. From its side pocket, I withdrew a slim leather portfolio, different from the one containing evidence of Richard's betrayal. This one held my future. Inside were documents Evelyn had prepared, details of my new financial reality, properties now solely in my name, investment portfolios restructured for my benefit alone. A lifetime of financial dependence undone in 3 months of careful planning. Most significantly, the portfolio contained confirmation of my appointment tomorrow with the board of Camden Foundation, the charitable organization my grandfather had established and that Richard had managed for the past 30 years. The foundation that was meant to be my family's legacy, but had instead become another vehicle for Richard's manipulations. Not anymore. As a Cavendish by birth, control of the foundation should have been mine all along. Tomorrow I would reclaim it, along with the considerable influence it wielded in certain circles. Circles Richard had cultivated carefully throughout his career. My phone buzzed again from the nightstand, this time with a different tone. Rebecca. I hesitated, then answered. Mom? Is everything okay? Dad's been calling me, saying something about you leaving and not answering your phone. He sounds... I've never heard him like this. I closed my eyes, gathering strength. I'm fine, darling. Just needed some space to think. About what? What's going on? Dad said something about accounts being emptied. Are we being audited? Investigated? The panic in her voice made my chest tighten. Rebecca, always the practical one, immediately jumping to legal concerns. Nothing like that, I assured her. But there are things we need to discuss. Not over the phone, though. Can you meet me for breakfast tomorrow? The Four Seasons. I'm staying here for a few days. Staying at a hotel? Mom, you're scaring me. Just tell me what's happening. Tomorrow, Rebecca. 10:30. Everything will make more sense then. After her reluctant agreement and goodbye, I turned the phone off completely. The temptation to call my son Jonathan was strong, but his situation was more complicated. As Richard's partner at the firm, Jonathan would be facing his own professional crisis once the truth emerged. That conversation needed careful planning. Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by dreams of Richard's other life. Faces I'd only seen in photographs suddenly animated, laughing at me across dinner tables and birthday celebrations I'd never attended. I woke at dawn, exhausted but resolute. The hotel's concierge had arranged for a private stylist, who arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. By 8:15, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror, my silver hair freshly cut in a more dramatic bob that emphasized my cheekbones, subtle makeup enhancing rather than concealing my age, and a tailored navy suit that spoke of authority rather than the supportive elegance I'd cultivated as Richard's wife. You look magnificent, Mrs. Harrington, the stylist said, packing her supplies. Ms. Cavendish, I corrected, the name feeling strange, yet right on my tongue. I've decided to reclaim my maiden name. Her professional smile never faltered. Of course, Ms. Cavendish. The car is waiting whenever you're ready. Martin Goldstein rose as I entered his office precisely at 9 a.m. At 78, he moved with the deliberate grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention despite physical limitations. I'd chosen him specifically for his reputation, as the gentleman shark of Washington divorce law, relentless but discreet. Eleanor, he said, taking my hand in both of his. You look formidable. That's the intention, I replied, settling into the chair across from his imposing desk. It suits you. He returned to his seat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. I've filed the initial paperwork as requested. Judge Henderson has been assigned to the case, which is fortuitous. Indeed. Richard has been calling my office since 6 a.m. My assistant has been instructed to tell him only that you're represented and all communication should go through proper channels. I nodded, unsurprised. He'll try to circumvent the process. It's his nature to believe rules are flexible when they inconvenience him. Martin's smile was thin. The rules of divorce court are remarkably inflexible, especially when one party has maintained a separate family for nearly 3 decades. And the financial transfers? Completely legal. As we discussed, you've simply moved marital assets to different accounts that happen to be solely in your name, but that's hardly unprecedented in marriages of your duration and financial standing. He steepled his fingers. Richard, we'll fight it, of course. Let him. He'll claim you acted maliciously, that you deliberately set out to financially cripple him. I did, I acknowledged calmly, after discovering he'd been financially supporting a second family with my family's money for 28 years. Martin nodded, making a note. A jury would be sympathetic to that position, should it come to trial. But I doubt it will. Richard's too smart to allow this to become public. The scandal would destroy what's left of his reputation. And his practice. He's always been meticulous about his public image, I agreed. Both of them. Which brings us to the next matter. Martin opened a file. The Camden Foundation. My 10:30 meeting. Yes. As we've established, Richard has been using the foundation for questionable financial practices for some time. Nothing overtly illegal, but certainly unethical. As the last living Cavendish, your claim to leadership is unassailable. The board will have no choice but to accept your resumption of control. And, once I have that control, a complete audit would be appropriate, necessary even, given the circumstances. I smiled for the first time that morning. My thoughts exactly. Martin closed the file. The next 48 hours will be critical. Richard will attempt reconciliation first, then intimidation, then negotiation. He'll appeal to your history together, threaten exposure of private matters, and finally offer compromise when those tactics fail. You've dealt with men like him before. Men like Richard are rare, but not unique. Successful compartmentalizers who believe their intelligence exempts them from consequences. Martin's expression softened slightly. It's not my place to ask, but are you certain about this course? 50 years is a significant investment of your life. It was an investment based on fraudulent information, I replied, my voice steady. And I've decided to cut my losses. He nodded, satisfied. Your children are the wild cards here. How much? Do they know? Nothing yet. I'm meeting Rebecca after this. Jonathan will be more complicated given his professional connection to Richard. They may not take the news well. Adult children rarely respond favorably to discovering their parents' marriage isn't what they believed. I'm aware. The weight of those impending conversations pressed on my chest momentarily. But they deserve the truth, however painful. Our meeting concluded with practical matters, financial statements to be prepared, depositions to be scheduled, strategies for various contingencies. By the time I left Martin's office, I felt armored for the battles ahead. The car delivered me back to the Four Seasons with 15 minutes to spare before Rebecca's arrival. I used the time to check the secure email account Evelyn had established. Confirmation of the Foundation Board's attendance at our meeting. Notification that Richard had attempted to access several now empty accounts overnight. A message from the private investigator with updates on Catherine Williams' movements. Apparently, she'd been trying desperately to reach Richard since yesterday. Afternoon. The house of cards was indeed collapsing. I spotted Rebecca the moment she entered the hotel restaurant, my daughter's confident stride and elegant posture drawing glances from other diners. At 48, she was at the height of her beauty and professional success, a pediatric surgeon with 3 children and a seemingly perfect life. She resembled Richard physically, his height, his warm brown eyes, his disarming smile, but her moral compass had always been her own. "Mom." She kissed my cheek before settling across from me, her expression caught between concern and admiration. "You look different. Amazing, but different." "Thank you, darling." I felt it was time for a change. Rebecca studied me carefully as she unfolded her napkin. "Dad called 6 times last night. He wasn't making much sense. Something about accounts. Being emptied and you staying at a hotel. What's going on?" The waiter appeared to take our drink orders. I requested coffee. Rebecca opted for mimosa despite the early hour. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "You're scaring me," she said quietly after the waiter departed. "Are you ill? Is that what this is about?" "I'm perfectly healthy," I assured her. "But there are things about your father, about our marriage, that you don't know. Things I've only recently discovered myself." Rebecca's posture stiffened, her surgeon's focus now fully engaged. "What kind of things?" There was no gentle way to dismantle someone's understanding of their family history. I'd practiced various approaches in my mind, but in that moment, sitting across from my daughter in the sunlit restaurant, only direct truth seemed appropriate. "Your father has another family," I said simply. "A woman named Catherine Williams. 3 children, 6 grandchildren. They live in Portsmouth. He's been with her for 28 years. Rebecca's face drained of color, her fingers tightening around her water glass until I feared it might shatter. That's not possible. Dad wouldn't." "I have extensive documentation," I continued calmly. "Photographs, financial records, birth certificates. There's no mistake, Rebecca. This is insane." Her voice had dropped to a fierce whisper. 50 years of marriage and you're telling me he's had some secret family for almost 30? That's more than half my life." The waiter returned with our drinks, his cheerful inquiry about breakfast orders withering under Rebecca's glare. I requested he give us more time. "It can't be true," she insisted once we were alone again. "There must be some explanation. Dad is he's always been about family, about loyalty, about doing the right thing." The right thing. I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. "Like using my family's money meant for you and Jonathan and your children, to support his other household? To send his other children to private universities and buy them summer homes?" Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, God, the Camden Foundation?" I nodded. "Among other resources, he's been systematically diverting funds for decades. Very cleverly, very discreetly. And you just found out? How?" I explained about the phone call, the subsequent investigation, the evidence I'd gathered over 6 months of playing the unsuspecting wife while secretly unraveling 50 years of lies. "So you—" "What? Cleaned out the accounts?" She took a large sip of her mimosa. "Is that even legal?" "Completely legal. They were joint accounts, and I simply relocated the assets." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her father's expression when assessing a complex situation. "To where exactly?" "Secure locations. The specifics aren't important right now." "And the foundation?" "I'm meeting with the board in an hour to resume my position as chairperson. As the last Cavendish, it's my rightful place." Rebecca set down her glass carefully. "Dad's going to fight this. All of it. Yes. It's going to destroy him professionally. The scandal alone? That depends on how he chooses to proceed," I interrupted. "A quiet divorce settlement would be in everyone's best interest. Everyone except his other family." The words seemed to physically hurt her to say. "Their financial well-being is no longer my concern. Rebecca studied me with new eyes, not as her mother, but as someone unfamiliar and perhaps slightly dangerous. You've been planning this for months, while we were celebrating your anniversary, while we were toasting to 50 years of marriage. You knew then? Yes. And you didn't say anything? You let us all go on believing the fairy tale? I needed time, I explained. Time to gather evidence, to secure my position, to ensure that when I did act, it would be decisive. Cold-blooded, you mean? There was a new edge to her voice, not accusatory, but evaluative, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. I had no idea you were capable of this kind of strategic thinking. Neither did your father. I sipped my coffee. That was his mistake. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing. When she spoke again, her voice was hollow. Jonathan doesn't? Know yet, does he? No. I thought it best to tell you first. Jonathan's situation is more complicated. Because of the firm. Rebecca nodded slowly. This will hit him twice, personally and professionally. Dad made him partner just last year. I'm aware. I'll speak with him today. No. Her decision was immediate. Let me. This will be a shock, and Jonathan's always been volatile when blindsided. He should hear it from family first. I studied my daughter, her shoulders squared with new resolve, her inheritance of my pragmatism now evident, beneath her initial shock. Very well, but don't delay. Things will move quickly from here. What are you going to do now? She gestured vaguely at my new appearance, the hotel surroundings. After 50 years of marriage, what comes next? It was a question I'd asked myself countless times over the past 6 months. The answer had evolved from stunned uncertainty to clear intention. I'm going to reclaim what's mine, I said simply. My family name, my foundation, my financial independence, the life I might have had if I hadn't subordinated everything to your father's preferences and deceptions. Rebecca flinched slightly at that. And us? Where do Jonathan and I fit into this new life? You're my children, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. That hasn't changed and never will. But you're adults with your own lives. It's time I built mine. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, another trait inherited from her father, that refusal to show emotional vulnerability. I need time to process this, to talk to Jonathan. Of course. I squeezed her hand before releasing it. Just remember that your father will be desperate to control the narrative. He's very good at that. So it seems, she said quietly. So it seems. We parted in the hotel lobby, Rebecca's embrace briefer than usual, her expression troubled. As she walked away, I watched her go, wondering if I'd handled the conversation correctly, if there had been a better way to dismantle her understanding of our family without causing such pain. Probably not. Some revelations were inherently devastating, regardless of delivery. My phone buzzed with a reminder about the Camden Foundation meeting. I straightened my shoulders and headed toward the waiting car. One conversation down, countless battles still ahead. The Foundation's offices occupied the top floor of a historic building in downtown Washington. Old money disguised as charitable purpose. The receptionist did a double-take as I approached, clearly unaccustomed to seeing me without Richard beside me. Mrs. Harrington, she began, flustered. We weren't expecting Ms. Cavendish, I corrected gently. I believe the board is waiting. Her confusion deepened, but she gestured toward the conference room. Yes, they're assembling now. Mr. Harrington called to say he'd be delayed? He won't be attending, I informed her, already moving past the desk. This meeting concerns Camden Foundation governance. As a Cavendish matter, it falls outside his purview. I left her staring after me, mouth slightly agape. The conference room doors were heavy oak, carved with the Foundation's emblem. A lighthouse, my grandfather's tribute to his New England roots. I paused before them, drawing a deep breath. Then I pushed them open and stepped into the next chapter of my reclamation. 12 faces turned toward me. The Foundation's board members, most chosen, by Richard over the years, all accustomed to following his lead. Their expressions ranged from surprise to discomfort to barely concealed hostility as I took my place at the head of the table. "Good morning," I began, setting my portfolio before me. "I appreciate you all adjusting your schedules for this meeting. We have significant matters to discuss regarding the Foundation's leadership and financial governance." Lawrence Pemberton, Richard's college friend and longest-serving board member, cleared his throat. "Eleanor, while we're always delighted to see you, Richard chairs these meetings. Perhaps we should wait." "That arrangement is no longer appropriate," I interrupted smoothly. "As the last living descendant of Frederick Cavendish, I am resuming my rightful position as chairperson of this foundation, effective immediately." The room erupted in murmured confusion. Emily Winters, one of the few board members I genuinely respected, studied me with narrowed eyes. May I ask what prompted this reassertion of authority after so many years? Certainly. I opened my portfolio and removed a single document, passing it to her. This letter from my attorney outlines the legal basis for my claim. The original Foundation charter explicitly states that governance should remain with the Cavendish family whenever possible. I've allowed Richard to manage matters as my proxy for decades, but circumstances have changed. "What circumstances?" Lawrence demanded as the letter made its way around the table. I met his gaze directly. "Personal circumstances that I won't detail here, beyond saying that Richard can no longer be trusted with my family's legacy." The implication hung in the air, heavy with unspoken scandal. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Emily spoke. Again, her legal training evident in her careful phrasing. "While the charter does support your claim, Eleanor, this is unprecedented. There are protocols, transition procedures, all outlined in the documents my team will distribute momentarily," I assured her, "including the appointment of independent auditors to review the Foundation's financial activities for the past 30 years. That silenced the room entirely. Lawrence's face flushed deep red, while others paled visibly. They knew, or at least suspected, that Richard's management wouldn't withstand genuine scrutiny. "An audit seems excessive," Lawrence finally sputtered. "Richard's stewardship has been exemplary. The Foundation's assets have grown considerably under his guidance." "Yes," I agreed. "They certainly have. Now we'll discover exactly how and where that growth occurred, and who benefited." The unspoken accusation was clear. Several board members exchanged nervous glances. "If there are no further objections to my resumption of the chairperson role, we can proceed with the agenda." I looked, around the table, meeting each gaze steadily. "No? Excellent." For the next 2 hours, I methodically outlined the changes I intended to implement: new governance structures, enhanced transparency measures, revised grant-making priorities. The board's resistance gradually faded as they realized the extent of my preparation and determination. By meeting's end, even Lawrence had fallen into reluctant compliance. As the members filed out, Emily lingered behind. Once we were alone, she turned to me with undisguised admiration. "I don't know what Richard did," she said quietly, "but it must have been significant to provoke this response after all these years." "It was." She nodded, accepting my reticence. "For what it's worth, I've had concerns about certain financial decisions for some time. Nothing concrete enough to justify formal objection, but patterns that seemed questionable. Those patterns will be fully investigated now." "Yes." She gathered her belongings. "I look forward to working with you directly, Eleanor. It's been long overdue." After she departed, I remained alone in the conference room, my grandmother's portrait watching from the wall above the fireplace. Charlotte Cavendish had been a formidable woman in her own right, managing the family shipping business while her husband served in the Second World War, later establishing education initiatives that evolved into the Foundation's earliest programs. "I reclaimed it, grandmother," I whispered to her painted visage, "just as you would have done." My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Told Jonathan, calling you soon." One more difficult conversation awaited. But first, I needed to prepare for my next encounter with Richard. After my departure yesterday and this morning's foundation coup, he would be growing desperate. Dangerous, perhaps. The car was waiting to return me to the hotel. As I settled into the back seat, the driver handed me an envelope. "Delivered to the foundation office while you were in your meeting, Ms. Cavendish." The handwriting on the front was instantly recognizable. Richard's distinctive slant, the product of years of signing legal documents. Inside was a single sheet of the heavy cream stationery he used for personal correspondence. "Eleanor, you've made your point effectively. I understand your anger and acknowledge the pain I've caused. But this financial warfare helps no one. Meet me at the house this evening, 7 p.m. We can discuss reasonable terms that preserve both our dignities and protect our children from unnecessary scandal. 50 years deserves better than this ending." Richard, I refolded the note carefully and returned it to its envelope. After 50 years, Richard still believed he could manage me with carefully chosen words and appeals to propriety. Still thought he could dictate the terms of his own accountability. His greatest miscalculation yet. I pulled out my phone and composed a brief response to Martin. "Richard requesting meeting tonight. Proceeding with Phase 3. The reply came almost instantly. "Security team confirmed. Evidence secured. Proceed with caution." I leaned back against the leather seat, watching the familiar Washington landmarks slide past the window. Phase 3 would be the most difficult yet. The direct confrontation, the final accounting of 50 years of shared history and separate deceptions. But I was ready. The timid faculty wife who had once deferred to Richard in all financial and legal matters no longer existed. In her place was Eleanor Cavendish, reclaiming not just her name and her resources, but her power, the power Richard had never expected her to find. The hotel suite phone rang at precisely 3:17 p.m. I knew it would be Jonathan before I answered. My son had always been methodical, even in crisis. "Mother." His voice was tightly controlled, a technique I recognized from his courtroom appearances. "Rebecca tells me you've lost your mind." Despite everything, I smiled. Jonathan had never been one to soften difficult conversations with pleasantries. "Hello, Jonathan. I presume she told you about your father's other family." "She told me about your accusations, yes." The careful distinction was pure Richard, the attorney's instinct to question unfavorable evidence. "And about your financial restructuring." "Not accusations. Facts. Well-documented facts." A heavy silence followed. I could almost see him pacing his corner office, the one with the view of the Capitol that Richard had insisted befitted a rising partner. "I need to see this documentation," he finally said. "If what you're claiming is true, it is. Then the implications for the firm are significant. Dad's name is on the building, Mother. My name is right below it." Of course. Jonathan's first concern would be the professional ramifications. Not because he was cold, but because the firm was his identity, just as Richard had designed it to be. "I understand. That's why I've been discreet. The divorce filing is sealed, as is the documentation of your father's indiscretions." "Sealed documents can be unsealed." Jonathan's voice had the clipped quality it acquired when he was strategizing. "If Catherine Williams decides to make claims against Dad's assets, she'd have to admit to 28 years as the other woman," I pointed out. Not a sympathetic position, especially given her knowledge of Richard's marital status. "You've thought this through." The grudging admiration in his tone was new. 6 months of planning, Jonathan. I've considered every contingency. The silence stretched again, punctuated by the soft sound of his breathing. My brilliant son, so like his. Father in intellect, but with a moral compass that had always pointed true. How would he reconcile these new revelations with the man he'd idolized? I need to see him, he finally said. I need to hear his explanation. Of course you do. He's your father and your partner, and your husband of 50 years. There was an accusation embedded in the statement. Yes. 50 years during which he maintained a second family for more than half, I reminded him gently, while diverting my family's money to support them. Another silence, heavier than before. The Cavendish Trust, the foundation funds, among other resources. I heard a sharp intake of breath. Jonathan had worked with the foundation as legal counsel before joining his father's firm. He knew precisely how those funds were structured, and how carefully Richard had controlled all access. I've resumed my position as chairperson, I told him, as of this morning. Jesus, Mother, you've been busy. The professional mask slipped, revealing glimpses of the boy who'd once built elaborate Lego courtrooms to practice his future career. Dad must be desperate? Yes. He's requested a meeting tonight. Jonathan's tone sharpened immediately. Don't go alone. Whatever he's done, he's still a man who's just lost control of $50 million? I'm aware of the risk. I kept my voice dry. Security will be present, and my attorney has all relevant documentation secured. 50 million. He repeated the number, the magnitude finally sinking in. That's what you transferred? Approximately. The forensic accountants are still tracing some of the offshore movements. A soft thud came through the line. Jonathan sitting heavily in his chair, I presumed. I still can't believe this. Dad has always been so principled, at least professionally. Compartmentalization is a powerful skill, one he mastered decades ago. I paused, considering how much to reveal. His other children believe he's a widower who found love again. According to my investigators, he's maintained entirely separate personas: conservative family man in Georgetown, relaxed suburban father in Portsmouth. His other children, Jonathan repeated hollowly. I have half-siblings I've never met. The pain in his voice made my chest tighten. This was the cruelest part of Richard's betrayal, not just deceiving me, but depriving our children of knowing their own family. 3, I confirmed quietly. James is 46, a surgeon in Boston. Eliza is 43, teaches music at Juilliard. Thomas is 38, works in finance. All close to our ages, Jonathan observed. So he was already involved with her when Rebecca was born? Yes, their relationship began a year before. The silence that followed was different, heavier, weighted with implications. Jonathan was recalculating his entire childhood, just as I'd spent months recalculating my marriage. I need some time, he finally said. This is a lot. I understand. But Jonathan, I hesitated, then pushed forward. Your father will try to convince you this is temporary madness on my part. That I've misunderstood or overreacted. That's not the case. I know. His response was immediate, surprising me. Whatever he's done, whatever explanation he offers, the evidence must be solid if you've taken these steps. You've never been rash. The simple statement of faith loosened something in my chest. Jonathan might struggle with this new reality, but he didn't doubt my judgment. Thank you. The words felt inadequate. I'll handle the firm implications, he continued, his voice steadying. We'll need a strategy for clients, for the press if it comes to that. And I'll speak with Dad, but not right away. Take whatever time you need. Mother, he paused, and I heard the subtle shift as professional composure gave way to personal concern. Are you all right? Really? The question caught me off guard. In 6 months of planning, in all the conversations with detectives and attorneys and financial advisors, no one had asked about my emotional state. I considered lying, then decided Jonathan deserved better. I'm angry, more angry than I've ever been. And beneath that, there's grief for the marriage I thought I had. But mostly, I'm resolved. This chapter of my life is ending. But I'm writing the conclusion, not your father. Good. The single word carried approval, support, and something like pride. Let me know if you need anything, legal or otherwise. After we disconnected, I sat motionless, absorbing the conversation. Both my children now knew the truth, or at least the framework of it. The details, the photographs, the evidence of Richard's elaborate deception could wait. They had enough to process already. My secure phone chimed with a message from Martin. Security team confirmed for 6:30 at residence. Williams woman still attempting contact with RH. No success? I could. Imagine Catherine's panic as her carefully constructed world began to crumble. For 28 years, Richard had maintained the precarious balance between his two lives, ensuring neither woman had reason to question the narrative he'd created. Now that balance was destroyed, and she, like me, was discovering how little she truly knew about the man she'd built her life around. Unlike me, Catherine had no offshore accounts, no family fortune to reclaim, no legal standing to demand compensation for decades of deception. Whatever sympathy I might have felt for her as a fellow victim of Richard's manipulation was tempered by the knowledge that she'd entered the relationship with open eyes, accepting the role of mistress even if she believed the lie about his widowhood. Her children were another matter. Innocent parties in their father's elaborate deception, they now faced the collapse of their family history along with their financial security. The thought brought a twist of discomfort that I pushed aside. Compassion was a luxury I couldn't afford right now, not when my own children were struggling with the same devastating revelations. A gentle knock at the suite door announced the arrival of Evelyn Chen. The financial advisor entered with her usual crisp efficiency, tablet in hand, an expression professionally neutral. All foundation accounts have been secured, she reported without preamble. The automatic transfers to the Portsmouth property expenses have been terminated, as have the monthly deposits to Catherine Williams' personal account. I nodded, unsurprised. That Richard had been maintaining his second household through foundation funds. It was exactly the kind of camouflage he would consider clever. Charitable work, concealing personal indulgence. The foreign accounts? I asked. Frozen, as expected. He attempted access this morning through 3 different channels. And the Cayman transfers? Complete and secure. The identity verification protocols are in place. Only your biometric data will unlock those funds, I allowed. Myself a small smile. Richard had taught me the importance of contingency planning through his own example, now that education was being used against him. There's one more matter, Evelyn continued, her expression shifting slightly. The Riverside property. My smile faded. The Riverside property, a modest 3-bedroom house in Alexandria that Richard had purchased 30 years ago as an investment opportunity. I'd visited it only once, finding it charming but unremarkable. Now I understood its true purpose. What about it? Records indicate it's been continuously occupied since purchase. Utility bills, property taxes, maintenance costs, all routed through a shell company that traces back to the foundation. Another residence for them? The prospect of yet another property in Richard's secret empire made my jaw tighten. No, the occupant appears to be an elderly woman named Margaret Winters, age 87. No apparent family connection to Richard or Catherine Williams. I frowned, the name tugging at something in my memory. Winters? Was that his mother's maiden name? Possibly. The investigation is ongoing. Another piece of the puzzle, another strand in the web of Richard's deceptions. I made a mental note to have Marquez look deeper into this Margaret Winters. Perhaps she was merely a tenant in an investment property, but experience had taught me that nothing in Richard's carefully constructed world was simple coincidence. "What time is it?" I asked, suddenly aware of the lengthening shadows in the eye. "Sweet. Nearly 5, Evelyn replied. "Your car will be ready at 6. The security team is already at the residence, conducting preliminary surveillance." I nodded, feeling the weight of the coming confrontation settle on my shoulders. Despite all the preparation, despite the legal and financial protections I'd put in place, the prospect of facing Richard, of looking into the eyes that had watched me across breakfast tables and charity galas and family gatherings for 50 years while hiding such monumental betrayal, made my hands tremble slightly, Evelyn noticed. Her professional demeanor softened momentarily. "You don't have to go," she said quietly. "The legal process can proceed without a personal confrontation." Yes, it can. But I need to see his face when he realizes exactly what's happened. I straightened, my shoulders. I need to look in his eyes when he understands that this time he's not controlling the narrative. She nodded, respecting my decision without further comment. After reviewing a few additional financial details, she departed with the same efficient grace that had characterized all our interactions over the past 3 months. Alone again, I moved to the closet where I'd hung the outfit chosen specifically for this evening's meeting. Not the navy power suit from the foundation board meeting, but something more subtle, a dove-gray dress with impeccable tailoring and subtle pearl accents. Elegant but understated. The perfect costume for the final act in my marriage to Richard. Harrington. As I dressed, I found myself examining my reflection with new awareness. The woman in the mirror was still Eleanor, the same silver hair, the same blue eyes, the same features that had aged with dignity, if not particular distinction. But something had changed in those eyes, in the set of that mouth, in the way those shoulders carried themselves. I looked resolute, determined, unafraid. The Eleanor who had greeted guests at our anniversary party 6 months ago had been accommodating and pleasant, content to exist in the carefully maintained glow of Richard's success. That Eleanor had believed in a partnership of 50 years, in a shared history built on mutual respect if not passionate romance. That Eleanor had been a fiction, a character in the elaborate play Richard had been directing for decades. The real Eleanor, the woman who had systematically dismantled her husband's financial empire in 3 months of methodical planning, was only now emerging. And she was discovering that vengeance suited her rather well. By 6 o'clock, I was ready. Hair perfectly arranged, minimal makeup emphasizing eyes and cheekbones, a single strand of pearls at my throat, my mother's pearls, not a gift from Richard. The finishing touch was deliberate. My left hand remained bare. The ring that had symbolized 50 years of marriage now nestled in a velvet pouch in my handbag. A small but significant statement. The hotel valet had the car waiting, not the usual car service but a private vehicle arranged by Martin's security team. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with military posture, gave me a respectful nod as he held the door. "Ms. Cavendish, I'm Thomas. We have 2 team members already at the residence and a third following at a discreet distance." "Thank you, Thomas. Has Richard arrived yet?" "Yes, ma'am. Approximately 20 minutes ago. Our team reports he's alone. And appears to be setting up some kind of display in the living room." I raised an eyebrow. "Display?" "Photo albums, according to the surveillance. Several bottles of wine. Appears to be preparing for a significant conversation. Of course he was. Richard would have carefully staged the scene, selecting photographs that emphasized our long history together, choosing wine that held sentimental significance. He would have crafted the perfect setting for the heart-to-heart conversation he believed would resolve this misunderstanding. Always the director, always controlling the narrative. I see. I settled into the back seat, my handbag positioned precisely on my lap. Let's proceed. The drive from downtown to Georgetown took less than 20 minutes at this hour. As we turned onto our street, my street, I noted the unmarked car parked 2 houses down, the security team member cleverly disguised as a food delivery person approaching a neighboring home, the subtle but reassuring signs that I wasn't facing this confrontation alone. Thomas pulled into our driveway, positioning the car for easy departure if necessary. Before he could exit to open my door, I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Wait here," I instructed. "If I'm not out in 1 hour, call Martin and then enter the house." He nodded, understanding the parameters without needing elaboration. These weren't ordinary security personnel, but specialists in high-conflict divorce situations, another resource Martin had provided without my having to ask. The walk to the front door felt surreal, as if I were approaching a familiar stage set, rather than the home I'd lived in for 35 years. Through the beveled glass panels, I could see warm light spilling from the living room, the flicker of candles, the careful orchestration of Richard's reconciliation scene. I used my key one last time and stepped across the threshold. Richard emerged from the living room immediately, his expression a carefully composed blend of contrition and dignity. He'd chosen his wardrobe as meticulously as I had, the charcoal sweater I'd given him last Christmas, tailored slacks, leather loafers polished to a soft gleam. His silver hair was freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven. He looked every inch the distinguished attorney, the respected husband, the pillar of the community. Only the slight tremor in his hands as he reached toward me betrayed his anxiety. "Eleanor." He stopped short of touching me, perhaps sensing my resistance. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I said I'd hear your explanation," I replied, my voice steady. "That hasn't changed." Relief flickered across his features. "Good. That's good. I've opened wine, the Bordeaux from our trip to France for our 40th. Do you remember that vineyard in Saint-Emilion?" Playing the nostalgia card immediately. "Predictable." "I remember," I said simply, moving past him into the living room. As Thomas had reported, Richard had created an elaborate display. Photo albums open to carefully selected pages, mementos from our years together arranged on the coffee table, music playing softly in the background. Our wedding song, another predictable choice. "Please sit." He gestured to the sofa where we'd sat countless times before, hosting dinner guests, reading Sunday papers, planning family gatherings. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since yesterday." I remained standing, taking in the scene with clinical detachment. "I'm sure you have." My failure to follow his script visibly disconcerted him. He'd expected tears, recriminations, emotional vulnerability that he could soothe with practiced responses. My calm assessment was clearly not part of his planned scenario. "Eleanor, I know you're angry. You have every right to be." He moved to pour wine into waiting glasses. What I did was inexcusable, but 50 years of marriage, of building a life, together, deserves more than summary financial execution. I noted his specific grievance, not the betrayal of our marriage vows, not the decades of deception, but the financial consequences I'd imposed. "Summary?" I repeated, allowing a hint of disbelief to color my tone. 28 years of maintaining a second family while systematically diverting my family's assets to support them hardly seems summary to me. He winced, setting down the wine bottle without having poured. "It wasn't like that. Not the way you're making it sound." "No? Then please, explain how it was." I gestured to the sofa he'd indicated earlier. "That's why I'm here after all, to hear your explanation." Richard sank onto the cushions, suddenly looking older than his 75 years. I remained standing, unwilling to accept the physical positioning he'd planned. Both of us on the sofa, turned toward each other in intimate conversation. "It began as an affair," he started, eyes fixed on his hands. "Catherine was a client, a young widow with a small inheritance to manage. It was meant to be temporary, a, a lapse in judgment. And yet it continued for 28 years, I observed. Quite an extended lapse. His jaw tightened briefly before he regained control. She was pregnant before I could end it. James. He wasn't planned. I couldn't abandon my own child, Eleanor. Surely you can understand that. I said nothing, waiting for him to continue digging the hole he seemed determined to excavate. I tried to do right by both families, he insisted, looking up at me with earnest eyes that had convinced juries and judges and clients for 5 decades. I never shortchanged you or our children. You've always had everything you needed. While they had everything they wanted, I interrupted coldly. Private schools, vacation properties, trust funds established at birth. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you divided resources equally, Richard. He flushed, the practiced composure slipping. The financial arrangements were complicated, but I never intended harm to you or our children. Catherine believed I was a widower when we met. Another lie. I shook my head. How exhausting it must have been keeping track of all your deceptions. I was trying to protect everyone. The first flash of genuine emotion, frustration breaking through the controlled facade. If Catherine had known I was married, if you had known about her and the children, the pain would have been immediate, I finished for him. Instead, you chose to extend it over decades, compounding the betrayal with each passing year. How magnanimous. Richard stood abruptly, abandoning the reconciliation script as his lawyer's instincts took over. What do you want, Eleanor? You've already taken every penny. You've seized control of the foundation. You've threatened my professional reputation and my relationship with our children. What more can this confrontation possibly achieve? There it was, the flash of the real Richard breaking through the carefully constructed persona. Not the contrite, husband seeking forgiveness, but the cornered predator assessing threats and calculating advantage. What I want, I said quietly, is for you to acknowledge what you've done. Not just the affair or the secret family, but the systematic theft of my family's resources to fund your preferred life in Portsmouth. It wasn't theft, he protested immediately. The accounts were joint. The foundation was my inheritance, I cut in. My family's legacy that you manipulated for your personal benefit. Let's call things by their proper names, Richard. After 50 years, don't I deserve at least that much honesty? He stared at me, reassessing. The practiced contrition was gone, replaced by the calculating awareness I'd seen countless times when he was developing legal strategy. You've changed, he said finally. No, I've merely stopped accommodating your version of reality. His eyes narrowed slightly. Who helped you with this? The financial transfers? The foundation takeover? You couldn't have managed that alone. The subtle insult, the implication that I lacked the capacity to orchestrate my own liberation, might have wounded the woman I'd been 6 months ago. Now it merely confirmed the righteousness of my actions. You underestimated me, I said simply. You always have. A flash of something like fear crossed his face, quickly suppressed. What happens? Now? You've made your point, taken your pound of flesh. We both know divorce at our age is complicated, messy. Surely we can reach a more reasonable arrangement. I reached into my handbag and withdrew 2 items, the velvet pouch containing my wedding ring and a sealed envelope. My attorney will contact. Yours tomorrow to arrange formal deposition schedules, I said, placing both items on the coffee table between us. In the meantime, this document outlines the terms I'm prepared to accept for an uncontested divorce. They're quite generous, all things considered. Richard stared at the envelope as if it might explode. And if I contest? Then every detail of your double life becomes part of the public record, I replied calmly. Every photograph, every financial transaction, every deception documented in excruciating detail. Your professional reputation, your standing in the community, your legacy at the firm, all sacrifice to avoid accepting the consequences of your own actions. You wouldn't. But his voice lacked conviction. He knew me well enough to recognize resolution when he saw it. I would prefer not to, I corrected, for the sake of our children and grandchildren. But make no mistake, Richard, I will not be manipulated or maneuvered out of what is rightfully mine. Not my family's money, not my dignity, and certainly not my future. He sank back onto the sofa, the fight visibly draining from him. For the first time in our confrontation, perhaps for the first time in our marriage, I saw Richard without artifice. An old man facing the collapse of his carefully constructed world. What about Catherine? The children? He asked, his voice hollow. They had no part in my deceptions. Your other family's welfare is no longer my concern, I replied. Though I imagine explaining to them that you're not actually a widower will be challenging. He flinched. They don't deserve to suffer for my mistakes. Neither did I said quietly. Neither did Rebecca and Jonathan. Yet here we are. Richard looked up, meeting my gaze directly. 50 years, Eleanor. Doesn't that count for anything? I considered the question seriously, weighing 5 decades of shared history against 28 years of calculated betrayal. It counted for everything, I finally answered. That's why I spent 6 months ensuring I had incontrovertible evidence before acting. That's why I'm offering terms that allow you to maintain some dignity despite what you've done. That's why I'm standing here having this conversation instead of simply serving you papers through an attorney. I moved toward the door, our discussion complete as far as I was concerned. Richard rose quickly, following. You've thought of everything, he said, a note of bitterness creeping into his voice. Planned every detail, the perfect revenge. I paused, at the threshold, turning to face him one last time. Not revenge, Richard. Justice. There's a difference. And what about forgiveness? He asked, a final attempt to leverage the moral high ground. Isn't that part of justice, too? Forgiveness requires repentance, I replied evenly. You're not sorry for what you did, only that you were caught. There's a difference there as well. With that, I walked out the door, leaving behind 50 years of marriage and the man who had defined my identity for so long. Thomas was waiting beside the car, alert for any sign of trouble. But Richard remained in the doorway, watching silently as I departed. As we pulled away from the curb, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only the strange lightness that comes with finally setting down a burden carried too long. The confrontation had gone almost exactly as I'd anticipated, Richard cycling through his predictable strategies, nostalgia, contrition, self-justification, and finally the attempt to claim moral victory through appeals to forgiveness. What he hadn't tried, what perhaps he was incapable of offering, was genuine remorse. Not for being caught, not for losing control of the narrative, but for the damage his choices had inflicted on those who trusted him. That absence confirmed what I'd suspected throughout our marriage. Richard's emotional landscape was fundamentally different from mine. Where I experienced attachment, loyalty, and commitment, he viewed relationships as assets to be managed, roles to be performed, resources to be allocated according to his preferences. For 50 years, I had mistaken his performance for authentic connection, no more. My phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan. Dinner tomorrow? Rebecca's coming too. We need to talk. I typed a simple response, looking forward to it. Whatever came next, the legal proceedings, the inevitable social fallout, the reshaping of family dynamics, I would face it clear-eyed and resolute. Eleanor Cavendish was reclaiming not just her financial resources, but her autonomy, her perspective, her right to define her own narrative. And Richard, for the first time in 50 years, would have to accept a story he couldn't control. 1 year later, I stood on the deck of my Maine beach house, watching the Atlantic waves crash against the rocky shore. The autumn air carried a crisp edge that hinted at the coming winter, but the afternoon sun provided just enough warmth to make the outdoors pleasant. "Coffee, Ms. Cavendish." Maria, my housekeeper, appeared at my elbow with a steaming mug. "Thank you, Maria." I accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping my hands around its warmth. The past 12 months had unfolded with surprising swiftness. Richard had accepted my terms for an uncontested divorce within 48 hours of our final confrontation, his lawyer's pragmatism ultimately overriding his pride. The proceedings had been completed with minimal public attention, sealed records protecting both families from unnecessary exposure. My phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. "Just landed. Jonathan picking us up. See you for dinner around 6. I smiled, anticipating the evening ahead. My children visited monthly now, our relationship deepened by the honest foundation we'd established in the wake of Richard's exposure. The initial shock and disbelief had given way to a new understanding, not just of their father, but of me. They'd come to see me not simply as Richard Harrington's wife, but as Eleanor Cavendish, a woman with her own strength and identity. The Margaret Winters mystery had been solved during the divorce proceedings. She was Richard's aunt, his mother's older sister who had been erased from family history due to a decades-old feud. Richard had secretly maintained a relationship with her, providing the Alexandria home and financial support while concealing her existence from everyone, including his secret family. In this one matter, at least, his deception had been rooted in something approaching genuine care rather than self-interest. I'd chosen to continue the arrangement, transferring the property to Margaret's name and establishing a trust for her ongoing care. It seemed the decent thing to do, and decency had become increasingly important to me as I reconstructed my life around my own values rather than Richard's convenience. The Camden Foundation had flourished under my leadership, its mission refocused on educational opportunities for women, a subtle but meaningful redirection of my family's legacy. The forensic audit had revealed the full extent of Richard's financial manipulations, resulting in substantial restitution to the foundation's endowment and a complete restructuring of its governance. As for Catherine and her children, Richard's other family, I had maintained my distance, though I knew from Jonathan's careful updates that they were adjusting to their new reality. Richard had apparently confessed everything, faced with no alternative when Catherine discovered the extent of his deception. Their relationship had not survived the revelation, though he continued to support his other children financially from his significantly reduced resources. The wind picked up, sending spray from the crashing waves high into the air. I sipped my coffee, reflecting on the strange path that had brought me here. At 73, I had expected to be settling into comfortable retirement with my husband of 50 years, hosting grandchildren and charity events, gradually fading into the dignified twilight my mother had modeled. Instead, I found myself embarking on an unexpected third act, financially independent, professionally engaged with the foundation, and personally discovering aspects of myself that had been subsumed by decades of marriage to a man who had never truly seen me. There was sadness in that realization, certainly. 50 years was half a lifetime, and not all of it had been a lie. We had raised 2 remarkable children together. We had shared genuine moments of connection and joy. Richard had been a good father to Rebecca and Jonathan, whatever his failures as a husband and moral agent. But there was liberation too. In the truth, in the reclamation of my identity, in the discovery that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The timid faculty wife who had deferred to her husband in all significant matters had been replaced by a woman who had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated financial reclamations Washington had seen in decades. My grandchildren now knew that story, an edited version, appropriate to their ages, but fundamentally honest. They knew their grandmother had faced betrayal with courage and resilience. They knew that women could be powerful in their own right, not merely as adjuncts to powerful men. That legacy, more than the money or the properties, or even the foundation, felt like my most meaningful achievement. The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, painting the waves with gold and crimson. I finished my coffee and turned back toward the house, where Maria was already preparing for my children's arrival. The dining room table would be set with my grandmother's china, the silver polished to a mirror shine, the conversation flowing freely without the constraints of secrets and deceptions. As I stepped inside, closing the door against the strengthening wind, I caught sight of my reflection in the entryway mirror. Eleanor Cavendish looked back at me, silver-haired, clear-eyed, straight-backed with dignity that came not from social position but from self-knowledge. Not a victim of betrayal, but a woman who had refused to accept deception as her due. 50. Years of marriage had ended not with the golden celebration we'd planned, but with the cold clarity of truth. The offshore accounts that now secured my future were not what I would have chosen had I been given an honest choice 50 years ago. But as I moved through my home, not Richard's, not ours, setting out family photographs that told a true if incomplete story, I found myself unexpectedly at peace. The anger that had fueled my meticulous planning had gradually transformed into something quieter but more enduring. The certainty that I had acted with integrity in the face of profound dishonesty, and that, after 50 years of living someone else's carefully scripted narrative, was perhaps the most valuable asset I had reclaimed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.